We walk through the city the way we walk through nature, but are surrounded by an environment that has been molded to accommodate us. We navigate streets through canyons of artificial stone and look up, dwarfed by the walls that have been built around us. It's surprising how little we notice. We live our lives surrounded by a manufactured world, but take little interest in how it looks or how it feels. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a movement that revolutionized the shape of our environment. It had been developing for decades, but in the aftermath of World War II, it finally found a voice in America. It was called modern architecture, and it redefined space, how we lived in it, how we worked in it, and how it expressed itself to the world. This is a documentary about mid-century modern architecture. This is a story about looking up and noticing the details of the canyon walls. Architecture is the cornerstone of our built environment, and it affects all of us. How we live, how we feel, our relationships, our dreams, and our memories.
What is architecture? Architecture is the stage set for our lives. Architecture is where we live, architecture is where we work, architecture is where we hope we express our personality and our values. Architecture in the public realm is how we set the spirit of an age, how we make tangible in bricks and mortar or steel and glass, as the case may be, what our aspirations are.
Architecture is probably the only art form that's functional. You use it every day. You have to. It's shelter. It's it's where you work. It's where you live. But it's sculptural.
In school, with first year, with beginning architecture students, we talk about it mostly in terms of space making, space defining, how one experiences space, how light falls within a space. What the materials are that define a space, what the forms are that define a space.
What is architecture? Yeah, the study of the form, and how it relates to the human, and its well-being, and it's not just about putting up walls and calling it a building.
Mid-century modern architecture is a term used to describe a trend in American architecture that started in the mid-1930s and lasted into the late 1960s. Mid-century modern architecture was sleek and sexy. It was flat roofs and sloped roofs. It was glass towers, steel frames, and concrete columns. Mid-century modern architecture was the manifestation of the future with no thoughts of the past. It was optimistic, it was a lifestyle, it was technology. It was how people lived in America when the sky was the limit. But in order to understand mid-century modern architecture, you first have to understand that the evolution of modern design started with a transformation in building materials in the late 19th century, notably structural steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. The only thing needed at this point was a new attitude that would release designers from the traditions of the past and inspire them to look for a new way of thinking. Doing just that was the Bauhaus in Germany.
Oh, Bauhaus is both a place and an idea. And both the place and the idea were the work of architect Walter Gropius. Gropius was one of the so-called fathers of the modern movement. one of the first of his generation to explore open spaces and new materials. By the post-World War I period, Walter Gropius was well established as an architect, and he had an opportunity to create a new kind of art school. Training in the arts up to that point, particularly in the European sector, had been very firmly segregated. There were the fine arts. There were the applied arts. Architecture was still finding its voice as a discipline. Gropius didn't believe that those segregations of knowledge and practice made any sense in a modern age when all buildings should be practical, economical, and functional. Gropius was asked by the Weimar Republic to create a new school where he could, in fact, employ his beliefs, and that was the Bauhaus.
Form ever follows function is the phrase coined by architect Louis Sullivan that called to task the role of the architect. Prior to the modern era, the exterior of a building was an expression of styles of past traditions. But near the turn of the 20th century, a new attitude was developing that the exterior of a building should reflect the function of the interior. The idea of form follows function was a founding principle of modern architecture.
Form and function. A library, how can a library be made to look like a library? How can the function of the building be expressed through its form? How can the use of the building, be it a library or a church or a courthouse or a store, express what's happening on the interior? You know, does it feel like it's expressing what it was intended to do?
Attempting to answer that question was Arkansas native and world-renowned architect Edward Durrell Stone in his design for the Fine Arts Center. The center was inspired by the idea of the Bauhaus and integrated music, fine art, and theater under a single roof. The design reflects the form follows function credo of the modernists, with simple lines and lack of unnecessary ornamentation. Opened in 1951, the Fine Arts Center is a local interpretation of the international style, which Stone embraced early in his career.
That's a classic modern project. It's very much molded on the international style vein. So it's very similar to work that Walter Gropius, the great modernist, did in the Bauhaus, and another project that he did just a year or two earlier up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Harkness Commons. It's one of a number of significant modern institutional projects, of which MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, was the first one. This one's probably the last one. It was done in 1949, and that was just a few years before he completely transformed his practice into what later became that more decorative phase. So it's a bookend, essentially. MoMA is the beginning, and the Fine Arts Building is pretty much the end of his modernist phase in institutional buildings.
It really functioned the way they intended. It's surprising that when that building was done in 50-51, there were really no others around the country where all the arts were under one roof. And people came here from so many other colleges and toured our building, wanted to see what was going on and so forth. But the building worked in that students intermingled, students collaborated. We had our architectural design studios full of art students, full of music students, theater people. And we'd go over and our students and look at their set designs in theater and make suggestions and so forth. So they all in the process began to realize that all these arts are governed by the same set of design rules. We used to do lectures, rhythm, balance, scale, theme, and a lot of musical terms we're using. Themes are in buildings, you know, they get repeated and picked up and varied and so forth, just like that happens in music.
The International style is the first movement in modern architecture that embraced functionality, simple forms, clean lines, and open spaces. It emerged in concert with Gropius and Bauhaus and was inspired by the modern materials of structural steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. It was called the International style because it didn't reflect an established cultural history. It didn't look German. It didn't look French. It crossed borders. A building of the International style would look the same in Switzerland as it would in Mexico. The movement sought a standard for architecture based on utopian aspirations of an equal society, in which class distinctions within the built environment were minimized.
The difference between Beaux-Arts style and International style is that Beaux-Arts was centered on the old medieval way of doing architecture. It was centered on the old Romanesque styles, the Greek styles. They were all being recreated. They were stealing from those developments. The International style was a reaction against that, totally against the old history of architecture. And it was really a wave of a change and wave of the future.
So modern architecture came along as a revolt. You have to see it as a revolt. It wasn't an evolution of architectural thinking. It was a revolt just to change things, make buildings functional again. So we believed in things like functional planning. We believed in the proper use of materials. We called it being honest in the use of materials, things of that nature. Site relationships. You do one kind of building in the country, you do a totally different building downtown. But yeah, we were evangelists, really, when you get right down to it, for modern architecture.
The first test of this revolution in popular culture came in the 1920s in the form of art moderne, which also embraced simplicity of design, no ornamentation, and flat roofs. Often confused with Art Deco, Art Moderne lacks the intricate, historicized, and geometrical ornamentation that identifies Art Deco. This is Art Deco, and this is Art Deco. But this is Art Moderne, with its curvilinear walls that emphasize the streamlined wind tunnel aspect that helped define the style. And there are these buildings. The Hotel Mountain-Air was built circa 1947 to meet the growing needs of America's automobile culture as travelers drove between Little Rock, Hot Springs, and Dallas. In the late 60s, the hotel was converted into apartments and later a nursing home, but has been vacant since the mid-90s. The current owner of the hotel is aware of its unique architectural qualities and is optimistic the buildings will find their place in the future of Hot Springs. Until then, they sit empty, an architectural relic that speaks to another time.
Hotel Mountain-Air is most assuredly unique in Arkansas architecture of the 20th century, and it occupies a very special place. It's a transitional building. Dare we say it's got 1 foot in the past, but it's about to make a leap to the present. On the one hand, it's built of a traditional material. It has the solidity of its masonry brick walls. It's got the closure and the comfort of tight traditional spaces, arguably appropriate to its function as a hotel. But it has moments. in the way it turns a corner, in the way that its balconies pop out, the design elements with which those balconies are articulated, and overall, the smoothness, the clarity, the simplicity of its walls when seen as an ensemble. Those latter facets begin to speak to a burgeoning modernism. But it's not burdened with the gloss or the chill of steel and glass that we so often associate with a higher style of modernism, a more up-to-the-moment 50s modernism.
In architecture, it's sometimes difficult to pin movements down to specific times. While Art Moderne was introduced in the mid-1920s, the Hotel Mountain Air wasn't built until the late 40s. In the 20s and 30s, architects were just beginning to explore the revolutionary ideas of the international style. If you look through a book on modern architecture, it's easy to find images of buildings that look out of place for the times in which they were built. There's the Steiner House by architect Adolf Loos, the Lovell House in Los Angeles by Richard Neutra, the German Pavilion in Barcelona by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and the Villa Savoy by Le Corbusier. None of these buildings seem to fit the world as it existed at the time. Even more remarkable are these drawings. Sketched on photographs are designs for buildings completely anachronistic to their surroundings. Conventional understanding suggests glass and steel buildings were products of the post-war era, but they were being conceived more than 20 years earlier. This is the work of Mies van der Rohe, a German architect who immigrated to the United States in the late 1930s and exerted a profound influence on how modern design took shape in America. Warren Seagraves is one such architect who was influenced by Mies.
Well, if you're familiar with the work of Mies van der Rohe at all, you notice a kinship with the work of Mies. But in terms of specific characteristics, the exposed steel frame is a dead giveaway, especially around here. And Mies kind of pioneered that idiom as a very adaptable sort of space, universal space, a single particular way of putting a building together and configuring space could be used for any number of purposes. At IIT, you'll notice that there are classroom buildings, administration buildings, laboratory buildings, a chapel, all essentially steel frame with brick infill. And you look at Warren Seagraves' work of just a few years later, maybe 10, maybe 15 years later, including the building that we're sitting in right now, and you see a very similar palette of materials. The steel frame, very rational, very simple, brick infill. At IIT it's buff brick, here it's orange brick. If you go look at the SWEPCO building here in Fayetteville, the steel frame is exposed there in a 4 or 5 story building, but the infill, instead of being brick, is slate, which is perhaps a little bit of innovation, a little bit of tweaking on Seagraves' part. So the relationship in terms of materials, in terms of articulation, the way the space is laid out, very similar to what Mies did.
Whenever he took that Miesian kind of agenda and applied it in a local way where he had to negotiate, the work stands on it by itself. It becomes Warren Seagraves rather than Mies. Seagraves' best work distinguishes itself when it has to deal with local circumstance. In this case, a sloping site. And so the whole way, because Mies' idea of operating in the land or in the city was always to have tabula rasa, everything leveled flat, so that it kind of played up with the horizontal aspects of his architecture, the extension of space. We're in the Ozarks, so it's very different. And in some cases, Seagraves has flat sites, but his best projects, I find, are when he has to negotiate this universal language with the local circumstance.
When I was a child, the shopping district in the early 70s in Fort Smith was Garrison Avenue. And the old Boston store and some of those stores that we would visit were along that road. But at the end of the road towards the bridge, there was this modern bank building. And I always remember I was struck by the color, this blue panel on the wall, and it just looked like something from the future set in the history of yesterday. I think it was one of the buildings that as a young child influenced me into thinking, well, maybe I would like to do something like that someday.
Another architect bringing modernism to Arkansas was Bob Laser, a partner in the firm of Nelson, Laser, and Cheyenne in Fort Smith, where, in 1961, he completed the first federal bank building. Probably the most distinguishing feature of this building is its ribbons of blue glass that comprise the curtain wall. Since the building is supported by a skeletal frame, the walls are non-structural. They don't hold up the building. The glass curtain wall is a product of the new building techniques of modern architecture. They gave architects a new means for expression. For Bob Laser, however, the distinctive blue panels were not part of his original plan.
We thought of the curtain wall on this first federal building as being a wall of entire glass, gray charcoal from top to bottom. So we started building it, and we received the shop drawings on the curtain wall, which we checked out. And along with those shop drawings, we received samples of the glass, the various glass colors that Pittsburgh had to select from. So I took the charcoal and put it on top, took my samples across the street to Mr. Rogers and presented them to him. And I said, now, Mr. Rogers, this is the way we want the building to look. And so this is the charcoal sample that I want to use for the panels. And he looked at that and says, let me see these other samples. So we laid them all out on the table, the various colors that Pittsburgh offered. So he looked those samples over and he said, Bob, I like that blue. I said, oh my goodness. I said, now I'm your designer, Mr. Rogers, and I picked the charcoal, and you're supposed to take my advice. And you've taken it admirably in everything that we've done so far, that we've presented. He said, well, nonetheless, I like that blue glass. He said, now I'm going to take that to my board. So he took it to the board, and he sold the board on the blue glass. And he came back to me and said, Bob, this is what we want. This is what I've sold the board on. I don't care about the rendering. He said, I want the blue glass building. Well, I was just downhearted. And I've argued with him about it. He wouldn't budge an inch. So we had to end up using the blue glass, and that's the story of the blue glass.
And in many ways, when I look at the First Federal Bank, I think of it as being Arkansas's cognate for the Lever House. It embodies that idea of 1950s high modern corporate aesthetic. Very clean, very much accommodating the universality of the modern plan to the specificity of the site. Like Lever House, it occupies a corner. It rises up to a proportionally great height after creating a relationship with the streetscape. It is, an absolutely textbook example of the contemporary post-war high-rise and all of the cultural connotations that brought.
World War II was a watershed event, and its aftermath launched America into a new industrial economy that changed how people lived. States like Arkansas became less rural and more urban. People moved to the cities for manufacturing jobs that dominated the economy after the war and embraced the culture of the car. It was an optimistic period in the nation's history, and post-war America was a place where being modern meant looking forward rather than back. it was also a time of opportunity, a time when concepts of the international style could be introduced into the American landscape in what would eventually be recognized as mid-century modern architecture.
And so here was this insecure country who didn't have 1,000 years of history, who didn't have great cathedrals and palaces and all of the classical and Renaissance and Baroque sort of structures that existed in Europe. But yet we were the emerging nation. We were the new power in the world. We could engineer anything. We were all about engineering and what was new and modern and the future. And we did not need the past to define who we were. The United States at that period was all about the future is ahead of us. The past, look what happened in Europe. It didn't work so well, so this was our coming of age. And at that period, we just really didn't think that much about the past, I don't think. Nobody wanted to think about certainly the immediate past because it had been so dreadful and bloody and horrible. So this was a new nation forging ahead, the space program, automobiles, everything that had to do with engineering, that's what America was all about.
The term mid-century modern describes a variety of architectural styles that developed in the middle of the 20th century. Among them, the international style, as previously described, but also Wrightian, with its emphasis on the horizontal and its place in the landscape. Populist modern, which combines features of the international style and Frank Lloyd Wright into the form of the ranch house. Median, with its open spaces, steel frame, large windows, and emphatically articulated frame, a favorite of corporate America. Googie, with its unique rooflines and angled supports. Neo-expressionist, with its dramatic and sculpted shapes, and New Formalism, with its modern interpretation of classical forms, such as the column. If the international style represented a revolution, mid-century modern was the victory parade. This was an era of experimentation as designers sought new ways to express the capabilities of reinforced concrete, structural steel, and glass.
Well, it was a terrific change from the past, and of course it was at the end of the Second World War, and people were hopeful, and the world was changing, and I think that modern architecture represented that. You were not going back to create the same kinds of things that caused all the trouble in the world, but opportunity was there, and I mean, the attitude of people was just very, very positive, I think.
I think that mid-century modernism is a very optimistic architecture. It is forward-looking. It's looking for something new. It's looking for ways of improving life. It doesn't really worry about class or past social structures. It's looking for something fresh and something new.
Because what's remarkable about mid-century modernism is how quickly it became a popular style and how efficiently it was adapted, modified, stretched to serve a variety of functional purposes. So that the mid-century modern embraces the glass box skyscraper and the ranch house alike.
But what appeals to me, and I think a lot of artists of that period, was that finally the architecture was starting to represent the materials that the buildings were being built of. Instead of building a steel frame and then covering it with stone so that it would look like it was a bearing building made out of stone, the architecture tended to simplify and just get rid of the stone and express the real structure that was there. So you would actually see the frame, the steel frame, and not use it as a method to build a tall building that looked like it was made out of stone. So there was an honesty to it.
Well, what I like about mid-century architecture is really the cleanness of it. It was really a style that was expressive of how the building's put together. Very simple volumes, but the materials read through. You knew where the structure was.
The emphasis of the horizontal and vertical planes, the innovative use of materials at that time, the relationship to from the exterior and interior spaces.
I think mid-century modern, for a lot of people, filled a void. You know, that not everybody wanted to live in grandma's house with a geranium on the porch, that there was a future out there. You know, we won the war, and, you know, here are some new possibilities about how one would live.
In 1953, Winthrop Rockefeller, grandson of the millionaire industrialist John D. Rockefeller, moved to Arkansas. As both a politician and a philanthropist, Rockefeller had a vision for post-war Arkansas, and one of those visions was a new skyscraper in Little Rock. According to Rockefeller, Arkansas would never become the industrialized economy of his dreams without a modern high-rise office tower in the capital city. Working with developers from Dallas, Rockefeller pulled together the financial resources to get his plan off the ground. The tower building was designed by Dallas architect Harold A. Berry in collaboration with Little Rock architect Frank Eugene Withrow, and is a great example of the mid-century modern aesthetic. When completed in 1960, the 18-story office building was the tallest in Arkansas.
So the tower building was, I wouldn't say it was the first skyscraper, it was the first modern building in Little Rock. I believe it's 18 stories. It's very different from any of the other earlier buildings in that it's, you can read the building. It's very easy when you look at that building to know where the elevator and the stair cores are and how the mechanical system serves the building. It's very, it was designed really with nature in mind to some extent. It has a north-south orientation. The east-west walls are solid masonry, and then the north-south walls are glass and spandrel glass. So it's just a very clean, modern building.
But what strikes me the most about that building is the expression of use. This tall column that runs up the front of the building with its very intricate steel detailing and this mast that points its place in the world. You immediately see it from around town. And I just think it's one of the most elegant buildings, and it's still in use. And I can imagine on opening day what it was like for that architect to stand and look at that building.
From office buildings to schools, banks, and libraries, the mid-century modern aesthetic reached all corners of the American landscape.
Case study houses were a series of houses that were designed at the behest of a man named John N. Tenza, who had was the editor of a magazine called Arts and Architecture. And he asked a number of young architects after the war, starting in about 46, I believe, to design a house and have it include a number of new ways of seeing space, new ways of using materials, integrating the car since these were to be detached houses typically in suburban locations. So to look at new ways of living.
The rules for the case study houses were clear. Each house must be affordable and capable of duplication. It must be conceived within the spirit of our times and be made with the techniques and materials best suited to the expression of man's life in the modern world. From the case study houses and an abundance of home magazines, modern design trickled down through American popular culture, reaching middle-class families interested in something other than the traditional American home. One such family was a newlywed couple in Fort Smith, Arkansas, who stirred controversy when they built their distinctively modern home in 1950.
And Dot and I discussed things, and she was familiar with an architect that I knew in Shreveport, Louisiana, that did contemporary structures, and wondered if he would do us a house. And I called him, and I was a great friend with his sons, and told him what we wanted, and he was quite well known in all over Louisiana and that part of the world. And he said, if you and Dot will come down every weekend during the summer, I'll design you a house.
There were 3 houses on this hill, and we were concerned about those people because one of the residents was very upset. She said we were ruining the value of her property by putting that, she called it a monstrosity, by putting that monstrosity on the corner. So that was really the only thing that bothered me, was the fact that the neighbors were unhappy with what we were doing. But we became very good friends with the people, and they accepted the fact that we were young and different and it didn't matter. But they were not happy in the beginning. What has amazed me is for many, many years people made fun of the house. In the last maybe 15 years, people want to buy it. We get offers from people all the time who want to buy the house. So their tastes have changed.
The Rappaport house is remarkable. It's streamlined, it's clear, it's tight in its planning and in its formal articulation. It is a very minimalist aesthetic on the exterior in terms of the clarity of its form and its geometry, yet it's one of those buildings that was typical of what was going on in high modern residential architecture across the country.
The architect of the Rappaport House was Sam G. Weiner, whose firm did stridently international style work, such as the Municipal Incinerator Building in Shreveport, which was recognized by major architectural publications of the time. But in Huntsville, Arkansas, it was a much younger architect, Bill Hill, who designed the Dennis House, a high modern home along Route 23.
Well, we got married in 1962, and we decided that we would build a new home. And we started this building in May of 1963.
Well, it was probably going to be a traditional until a friend of ours' husband was an architectural senior student at the U of A, and he was looking for a project. And he was a student, a senior, under a famous architectural teacher at the university, Fay Jones. And so then we sort of thought about it, and we went to see a modern home, similar. It was much smaller than this, but it was a Fay Jones home on Mount Sequoia, and we liked it. And so then Bill kept pushing us to maybe decide to build a modern home. And so he drew 3 plans, a round house, a square house, and a rectangle house. And so we chose the square home.
As with the Rappaport House, the Dennis House also has its critics, but it also has its share of admirers.
Our neighbors across the street told us that you would be surprised at the vehicles that stop and get out and take a picture of your house all the time during the day. Also, I was gone one time, and this couple stopped and asked Sue if she'd throw them to the house, and she did. And he looked. We got 9-foot ceilings in this house, and he said, "Is your husband tall?" Of course, I was 5'7".
Yeah, what about the Dennis house? Who expects to find a high modern house in Huntsville, Arkansas? And I think that's one of the remarkable things to note, that modernism came out of a belief that there could be a utopian code for architecture, that there could be one right way to build, and that we find these gem-like examples of post-war modernism all over the state maybe proves that postulate was right, that it could happen, that you could have a high modern house in Huntsville, Arkansas just as well as you could in New Canaan, Connecticut.
Modern design in residential architecture was expressed in a variety of different styles. There's this house in Fort Smith, built in 1963 by architect Robert Wanslow, which draws inspiration from a case study house by Charles and Ray Eames. And from a mid-century catalog of modern homes is this house in Magnolia, with its distinctive flat roof and angled supports. Mixed among the traditional homes that comprise our neighborhoods is a diverse array of mid-century modern designs.
Okay, so one of the great things about living in Carlson Terrace is these bricks. To me, this is one of the things that I really remember, because you could lay in bed in the afternoon if you were supposed to be taking a nap but you weren't sleepy, and you would look through the window and see all of these shapes. So this is kind of captivating for a small child. You see squares and diamonds and circles depending on what you're focusing on. So that was always really interesting to me. And then the shadows, the way the light came through the bricks was really interesting. So we would play on every single unit had a little porch, and this is where we spent a lot of time playing. It was like an extra room of the house. But the light and the shadows that were cast by the sun coming through those bricks was really incredible. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated most about it. These are some of my fondest memories of growing up, was living in Carlson Terrace.
What is Carlson Terrace? Do we call it married student housing? Do we think about it in a larger sense of low-rise, high-density housing in general? Do we think about it as a dormitory for veterans and other non-traditional students that just happen to have the baggage of family? And I think that complexity has problematized the consideration of Carlson Terrace, because it was not a typical university building. Married student housing was an entirely new type for the American scene in the post-war period. And to fail to see Carlson Terrace in that larger context of a changing university is limiting the meaningfulness of the architecture. And I think this is one of the problems in assessing and evaluating mid-century modernism in a more general way. Buildings are not just the steel and glass of which they are built. Buildings are not narrative in and of themselves. We don't look at the curtain wall and say, aha, it tells a story. But the circumstances about who produced a building, why it was produced, what it meant in the period in which it gained significance are critical for us to understand if we are going to make judgments about architecture of the past that go beyond the he said, she said of, I love that building, I hate that building, that's a beautiful building, it's not very attractive.
We did list the Carlson Terrace apartments on our most endangered places list in 2007. They were having plumbing problems and heating and air problems, and basically the infrastructure was just outdated, and so the school started looking at either tearing them down or fixing it, and decided that they were not financially, it wasn't financially feasible to fix the problems, that it would be more financially feasible to tear the buildings down. So that's what they ended up doing.
You know, just before it was torn down, I convinced my son and my daughter, my husband, to accompany me on one last visit. Sorry, don't put this in. It was hard to watch it go away because it held so many happy memories. It was such a beautiful place with the trees and the park-like atmosphere that it provided for growing up. So we went with a camera, and we were on kind of a scavenger hunt, really, to capture those last images. It was really interesting because I have all of these pictures of me and brothers and sisters in front of these walls. So it was really an opportunity to get those last shots of me standing in front of this place. It's good. This was a good place to grow up.
The Carlson Terrace apartments were designed by Edward Durrell Stone, who had entered a more decorative phase of his career. Stone had become well known internationally for his design of the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, which featured a concrete grille that appeared in much of his later works. While Carlson Terrace was lost, other works by Stone survive. In addition to the Fine Arts Center, there is the Bank in Hot Springs, the Felix Smart House, and the Pine Bluff Civic Center with its modern interpretation of traditional ideas.
That's one of the things that concerns me about modern architecture, that its place in history is compromised by its closeness to us, and that, you know, our ability to relate to it as part of our lives, for some people, takes it out of the specter of being historic. Understanding mid-century modernism involves breaking down a series of prejudices deeply ingrained in Western culture about what's art and what's not, about what's architecture and what's ordinary building. That just doesn't matter.
Mid-century design was such a total shift, I think, from anything that came before, that it's not always easy to get. It's not always appreciated. I think anytime you're dealing with issues of the recent past, it takes time to get this perspective on the importance of that time period or that event. And I think mid-century modern buildings are kind of in that gap of being old but not really old. And really, I think mid-century modern architecture is kind of it was such a departure from anything that came before. It's kind of the missing link between the way we built before and the way we build now.
As people in the middle of the 20th century were busy looking forward, there was no place for the past. It was during this period that many important examples of traditional, Victorian, and neoclassical architecture of the previous century were destroyed. Old hotels, office buildings, and schools were torn down to make way for the new. These buildings looked dated and old, and a lack of understanding or appreciation prevented their survival. As we reach further into the 21st century, architecture of the recent past is facing a similar fate. Buildings constructed during the mid-century modern movement are now 50 years old or older, yet their forward-thinking design makes them difficult to view as historic. Modern architecture started as a revolt against tradition and evolved into a movement that grasped for the future. It was the celebration of function over form that reveled in the possibilities of concrete, glass, and steel. It was about experimentation and variation. It was about clean lines and open spaces. Mid-century modern architecture was a part of the post-war culture that had such a defining effect on America. Even though tastes and styles change over time, modern architecture continues to be a source of inspiration for architects today.
You know, it's kind of hip to look at the 50s in terms of architecture. Again, stuff that when I was in school, we turned up our nose at. It was awful stuff. You know, we didn't dare consider a lot of that 50s stuff. We're in a period where it's being reappreciated, reappraised.
Mid-century modern had a lot of attributes that the international style, the old styles didn't have. And it was actually a springboard, I think, toward what we have now.
Today, as a practicing architect, I sometimes research the mid-century modern, go back to that, because particularly with housing designs, because you see that some of our clients still want this open space. And it's just going back to that mid-century when it was being further developed, what that open space meant.
The architecture of today is turning back to modernism. Really, the Axiom Tower in the River Market, if you look at it and the way that it's organized, there's a very linear positioning of the building east-west. There's more solid on the west and east, similar to what the tower building had as well. The cleanness of the front of the building has a reflection of the tower building. The top of the building, the way that it insets at the top with the columns expressed, very reminiscent of this style of architecture. So it's about building on the past, taking the best of these styles and taking it a step further, is what our generation's trying to do.
Most of us will never walk the halls of the Lever House or attend an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. But probably we will walk the halls of a local office building, stand in the foyer of a bank, or look for a book at a public library. We all live in a world of built objects, and how they affect us is as important to the human experience as that of the natural world. Take time to look at the canyon walls. Appreciate the details. Notice the lines. Experience the environment in which you live.